The hidden architecture of low intelligence. 6 psychological habits keeping people stagnant. Society loves to measure intelligence with standardized tests, academic degrees, and arbitrary scores, assigning an IQ number to define a person's absolute potential. But true intelligence, or the glaring, devastating lack thereof, reveals itself most clearly in the quiet, mundane, and repetitive moments of our daily lives. It is not always about solving complex mathematical equations or possessing a vast, encyclopedic memory. Rather, it is deeply embedded in the subconscious behavioral patterns we choose to repeat day after day. Many individuals consistently display daily habits that completely sabotage their personal growth, silently destroy their relationships, and permanently cripple their capacity to learn. These destructive behaviors are often swiftly labeled as a simple lack of self-awareness or generalized low intelligence. But if we pull back the curtain and look closely at the underlying psychology, we discover a deeper truth. These are not just simple, harmless mistakes. They are deeply entrenched psychological defense mechanisms, mental barricades that entirely block a person from ever moving forward in life. Let us embark on a comprehensive, psychologically rich deep dive into the exact 6 habits of low intelligence, exploring the neurological and behavioral traps that keep so many minds completely stagnant. 1. The hostile refusal to admit being wrong. The first and arguably most destructive habit is the complete hostile refusal to admit when one is entirely wrong. Imagine a common scenario. A person is presented with overwhelming, irrefutable, and absolute concrete evidence that contradicts their current belief or their recent actions. A highly intelligent, adaptable individual experiences a brief moment of cognitive dissonance, swiftly updates their internal mental models, and adapts to the newly presented information. However, someone trapped in a chronic cycle of low intelligence will do the exact opposite. They will aggressively double down on their original flawed stance, fiercely clinging to a sinking ship of a broken argument. Why exactly does this happen? It boils down to the extreme fragility of the human ego. For these deeply insecure individuals, protecting their fragile, artificial pride feels vastly more important to their immediate psychological survival than actually discovering the objective truth. They have unconsciously tied their entire sense of self-worth to the mere concept of always being right. Therefore, when they are proven wrong, they do not perceive it as a simple, correctable, intellectual error. Instead, they experience it as a deep, catastrophic personal failure. It instantly triggers a profound internal threat response inside their brain. When a person is proven wrong, the brain's anterior cingulate cortex registers a conflict. For a mind paralyzed by these limiting habits, it triggers an absolute cortisol spike, akin to a primal fight-or-flight survival response. They argue endlessly and aggressively because, in their deeply flawed subconscious mind, admitting a simple error practically equals existential death. Their identity is a remarkably fragile house of cards, built entirely on the shaky foundation of always appearing to be the smartest person in the room. When that weak foundation is violently shaken by undeniable reality, the resulting panic causes them to lash out. They will engage in toxic gaslighting, constantly change the subject, aggressively project their own inaccuracies onto you, or blatantly ignore physical reality entirely, just to soothe their burning ego. This profound failure to adapt is the absolute antithesis of intellectual evolution. They view being wrong as a permanent scar, rather than treating mistakes as the necessary stepping stones to personal mastery and betterment. This rigid, terrifying inflexibility makes them incredibly difficult to work with professionally, and it slowly, systematically poisons their intimate relationships, as their frustrated partners and exhausted peers eventually realize that reasoning logically with them is an exercise in complete futility. 2. The illusion of complete knowledge. Moving deeper into the psychology of human stagnation, the second undeniable sign is the overwhelming, completely delusional belief that they already know absolutely everything there is to know about a given topic. This is the ultimate manifestation of a closed mindset. Genuine intelligence is not a finite, perfectly mapped destination. It is an endless, continuous journey of daily discovery and constant mental refinement. But when a person operates strictly under the grand delusion of complete knowledge, their brain effectively hits an unbreakable brick wall. This closed mindset instantly eradicates natural human curiosity. It stops them completely dead in their tracks from ever asking probing, high-quality questions. It actively prevents them from exploring revolutionary new ideas. and it violently deters them from ever seeking valuable advice from individuals who genuinely possess more experience, profound wisdom, or technical skill. Because they arrogantly think their knowledge base is perfectly complete, they become entirely blind to their own massive ignorance. In the realm of psychology, this aligns perfectly with the famous Dunning-Kruger effect, a cognitive bias where people with extremely limited competence in a particular domain vastly and ridiculously overestimate their own abilities. They fundamentally lack the vital metacognitive skills required to accurately recognize their own glaring intellectual deficits. Consequently, they carelessly miss out on countless opportunities to fundamentally improve their personal skills and expand their understanding of an incredibly complex, ever-changing world. They walk through their entire life with an unwarranted arrogance, foolishly assuming they have absolutely nothing valuable left to learn. The concept of neuroplasticity clearly tells us that our brains are incredibly dynamic, profoundly capable of forming brilliant, highly complex new neural pathways well into advanced old age. However, this biological process is entirely dependent on receiving novel stimuli. You must deliberately introduce new ideas, complex problems, and challenging paradigms to forcefully push the brain to literally rewire itself for higher intelligence. By firmly and stubbornly believing they already know everything, they completely cut off this vital, life-giving supply of novel stimuli. Their brain violently shifts from being a rushing, dynamic river of thought into a dark, stagnant pond. Over the passing years, this profound mental laziness leads directly to a rigid, rapidly decaying intellect. They slowly become those bitter, angry individuals who are terrified of change, constantly and tragically longing for the distant past, simply because they have completely lost the psychological capacity to comprehend the modern present. They permanently lock the heavy doors of their own mind directly from the inside, and mistakenly believe they are safe, when in devastating reality, they are slowly starving to death intellectually. 3. Chronic victimhood and externalizing blame. The third destructive habit takes us directly into the dangerous territory of human locus of control. Individuals completely trapped in low intelligence patterns frequently, almost pathologically, blame other people, random bad luck, or unfair circumstances for their own personal failures, poor choices, and severe life shortcomings. They perpetually and enthusiastically play the dramatic role of the ultimate victim. In psychology, we refer to this phenomenon as operating with a purely external locus of control. They firmly believe that life is a random series of chaotic events that simply happen to them, rather than a moldable reality that they can actively, intentionally shape and directly influence. By constantly playing the victim and aggressively refusing to take even a microscopic ounce of personal responsibility for their daily choices, they willingly surrender their internal power to actually change their depressing situation. Think deeply about the profound, devastating implication of this specific mindset. If an individual truly believes that every single crushing hardship, every missed professional deadline, every failed relationship, and every painful financial struggle is entirely someone else's fault, then there is absolutely no logical reason for them to ever look deeply inward. There is zero internal motivation to figure out what they can do better, how they can rapidly evolve, or what specific, valuable skills they desperately need to develop. Because of this massive, blinding psychological blind spot, they essentially hypnotize themselves into a state of absolute, crippling powerlessness. This mirrors a devastating psychological condition known as learned helplessness, where an organism, after experiencing repeated perceived failures, completely stops trying to avoid pain or radically improve its situation, even when simple solutions are sitting right in front of them. The victim mentality is the human equivalent of this tragic condition. By externalizing all blame onto the outside world, it requires absolutely zero effort to simply sit back and passionately complain about the economy, the government, or a demanding boss. Conversely, it requires tremendous, grueling, completely agonizing mental effort to look deeply and honestly in the mirror and say, I am currently in this miserable situation entirely because of my own repeated poor choices, and only my own highly disciplined, relentless daily actions will ever get me out of it. Those permanently trapped in low intelligence completely lack this vital mental fortitude. They consistently choose the incredibly easy, highly comforting lie of chronic victimhood over the harsh, liberating truth of absolute personal responsibility. Because of this, they end up permanently stuck in the exact same negative, self-destructive behavioral patterns year after year. completely wasting their precious life while constantly waiting for a magical savior that absolutely will never arrive. 4. Emotional reactivity over rational thought. The fourth major behavioral trap involves the complete hijacking of the highly evolved rational brain by raw, unrefined, completely chaotic emotion. In addition to actively avoiding responsibility, these individuals inherently tend to base their critical judgments and monumental, life-altering decisions purely on their immediate, fleeting emotions, rather than on grounded, logical thought. The human brain is a marvel of evolution, brilliantly equipped with a highly sophisticated prefrontal cortex, specifically designed for complex problem-solving, logical deduction, and vital long-term planning. But when directly faced with sudden stress, overwhelming anger, or even intense excitement, individuals exhibiting severe low-intelligence behaviors simply allow their primitive emotional centers, particularly the amygdala, to take the absolute steering wheel. They let temporary, volatile, biological feelings completely dictate their actions. In the blinding heat of the moment, they willfully ignore obvious, undeniable facts. They completely disregard basic logic, and they totally overlook the severe, deeply painful long-term consequences that will absolutely and inevitably prove their impulsive choices to be entirely disastrous. Let us examine the crucial psychological concept of delayed gratification, which is universally considered one of the single greatest psychological predictors of lifelong success and profound intelligence. It is the sophisticated, incredibly valuable ability to willfully endure mild, temporary short-term discomfort or perfectly manage intense emotions in order to secure a vastly larger, highly meaningful long-term reward. Individuals exhibiting these low-intelligence emotional reactions completely fail at this fundamental psychological test every single day of their lives. They exist entirely as slaves to their own volatile biochemistry. When a well-meaning person constructively criticizes them, they do not pause to carefully and intelligently extract the valuable feedback hidden within those words. Instead, their incredibly fragile ego instantly catches fire, and they immediately erupt in defensive, irrational rage. When faced with a highly difficult, tedious daily task that could dramatically alter their career trajectory for the better, they quickly succumb to the immediate, slightly uncomfortable feeling of boredom. They immediately abandon the crucial task to seek the cheap, instantaneous, totally worthless dopamine hit of scrolling endlessly and mindlessly on social media. They constantly mortgage their entire brilliant future potential just to temporarily satisfy the fleeting emotional urges of the exact present moment. This wildly reactive, completely undisciplined nature constantly creates exponentially bigger, highly chaotic, totally exhausting life messes that they must inevitably clean up, completely destroying their ability to effectively solve complex problems or successfully navigate difficult life situations. 5. Aggressive rejection of differing perspectives. The fifth glaring habit is the deeply aggressive, hostile, and defensive shutting down of any different points of view. Cognitive flexibility, which is the magnificent, highly refined ability to openly entertain a complex thought without necessarily instantly accepting it as absolute truth, is a major, undeniable hallmark of high intelligence. Conversely, significantly lower intelligence almost always manifests as an extreme, terrifying cognitive rigidity. When directly confronted with a unique, different perspective that effectively challenges their pre-existing, comfortable worldview, instead of trying to empathize, instead of making a genuine, curious attempt to actively understand exactly where someone else is coming from, or rigorously investigating why they might hold a different opinion, they instantly perceive the mere disagreement as a direct, vicious, personal attack. Their primitive brain's ancient threat detection system actually treats a simple differing opinion the exact same way it would treat a dangerous physical predator in the wild. They fiercely, stubbornly, and irrationally protect their current, often unexamined, totally flawed core beliefs. They possess a deep, highly desperate psychological yearning to constantly exist within an insulated, highly comfortable, completely artificial echo chamber. This is a terrifying mental bubble where absolutely everyone totally agrees with them all the time, completely validating their flawed existence. In ancient tribal times, perfectly agreeing with the general consensus of the local tribe was a terrifying matter of pure physical survival. However, in our modern, hyper-connected, incredibly complex global civilization, this primitive software severely and dangerously malfunctions. This desperate need for constant, unbroken validation rapidly creates a narrow, highly distorted, completely false view of absolute reality. It severely limits and drastically paralyzes their vital ability to genuinely connect with human beings from different backgrounds, diverse cultures, or varied walks of life. True intellectual brilliance is constantly forged in the fiery, highly uncomfortable crucible of rigorous, deeply respectful debate. It absolutely demands that you actively seek out the highly intelligent, articulate people who completely disagree with your deepest convictions, and then silently listen to them with an open, eager heart. By violently and aggressively rejecting any and all dissenting opinions, they absolutely guarantee that their entire worldview will constantly remain fragile, untested, and dangerously out of touch with the massive, beautifully complex reality of the actual human experience. They would vastly prefer to fiercely fight tooth and nail to defend an old, outdated, and entirely unhelpful idea, rather than simply open their stubborn mind just a tiny fraction to a fresh, revolutionary perspective that could completely transform and massively improve their life. 6. Conversational dominance and failure to listen. Finally, we arrive at the sixth destructive habit, which reveals itself most evidently and embarrassingly in common social dynamics. They consistently, aggressively dominate every single conversation. They actively do this by talking excessively loud and remarkably fast, attempting to ensure with desperate certainty that their own voice is the only one in the room that actually matters. They constantly operate under the severe, highly narcissistic delusion that a basic human conversation is merely a captive platform for their own endless, completely exhausting personal monologue. By focusing entirely, with intense laser-like obsession, on exactly what they want to say next, rather than quietly and respectfully absorbing the valuable information other people are sharing, they completely miss out on the crucial chance to actively listen. They consistently treat everyday, casual conversations precisely like a high-stakes competition that they must absolutely win at all costs, rather than treating them as a mutual opportunity to deeply connect, exchange wisdom, and openly share brilliant ideas. This devastating failure to actively listen is arguably the most heartbreaking, deeply tragic habit of them all, precisely because it completely alienates them from the actual people around them. Think deeply about the profound, intricate beauty of a perfectly balanced, deeply engaging human conversation. It is a delicate, beautiful dance of continuous give and take, a magical transfer of human energy, immense worldly wisdom, and shared vulnerability. When they constantly and loudly dominate the surrounding airwaves, speaking aggressively to prevent anyone else from ever getting a single word in, they violently crush this delicate dance. They are utterly addicted to the cheap, fleeting, purely biochemical dopamine spike they receive from simply hearing their own loud voice and projecting their own inflated self-importance directly onto the captive, extremely exhausted audience around them. They operate exactly like a broken radio tower that can wildly broadcast a loud, highly distorted signal, but completely lacks the crucial internal receiver required to actually pick up anything valuable in return. True, profound listening requires the complete suppression of the human ego. It requires immense mental patience, absolute physical presence, and a genuine, intense interest in the complex inner world of another living human being. But because they violently refuse to simply be quiet, because they cannot physically tolerate the vital silence required to actually hear the profound truths other people are trying to tell them, they miss out entirely on learning valuable, life-altering lessons from the experienced, intelligent people surrounding them. This constant, highly compulsive psychological need to aggressively broadcast their own thoughts, while simultaneously ignoring the thoughts of everyone else, ultimately places an unbreakable, permanent ceiling on their own intellectual growth. Furthermore, it severely damages and slowly destroys their social relationships over time, leaving them highly isolated, profoundly misunderstood, and entirely unaware of the social destruction they constantly leave in their wake. Conclusion: breaking the cycle. When you carefully, meticulously, and rigorously combine all 6 of these deeply ingrained, highly complex, totally destructive psychological habits, a terrifyingly clear portrait begins to emerge. It is not just a portrait of generally low intelligence, it is a guaranteed blueprint for lifelong mediocrity and completely avoidable human suffering. Actively refusing to admit you are wrong locks you into a permanent state of ignorance. Constantly believing you already know everything violently kills the beautiful spark of human curiosity that drives all innovation. Aggressively blaming everyone else for your problems completely strips you of personal agency and the power needed to transform your own destiny. Allowing your immediate, primitive emotions to dictate your critical life decisions guarantees a chaotic, unpredictable existence full of avoidable regrets. Aggressively shutting down opposing viewpoints traps you inside a microscopic, suffocating mental prison of your own making. And finally, dominating conversations while failing to listen perfectly isolates you from the vast, infinite wisdom of the human collective. The true tragedy of low intelligence is not a lack of innate mental capacity. It is the stubborn, prideful, and emotionally reactive defense mechanisms that prevent that capacity from ever growing. Intelligence is muscle, adaptability, and above all, humility. To break free from these stagnant patterns, one must possess the ultimate courage to look inward, embrace discomfort, silence the ego, and realize that the most powerful words a human mind can ever utter are simply, "I do not know," "I was wrong," and "I want to learn."